Who is George Washington? Understanding the father of the nation of the United States. George Washington, the first President of the United States, we all know more or less about this name. Even the current capital of the United States is named after him to remember what he contributed to the country. However, most of us only know that. So today, let's learn more about who George Washington is, and discover more about this great man of the United States. Who is George Washington? An overview of the first President of the United States. To answer the question, who is George Washington? I would like to present you with some general information about this great man. George Washington is known as the first President of the United States, the father of his country, and a political and military leader during the early days of the nation. Born on February 22, 1732, and died on December 14, 1799, he led the American colonies to victory in the Revolutionary War against Great Britain and helped establish the United States as an independent sovereign nation. He was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army from 1775 to 1783. He is also famous for his farewell address, where he advised against political parties and long-term foreign alliances, which became a cornerstone in American politics. In addition, he helped establish the executive branch, set precedents for future presidents and served as the first president from 1789 to 1797. At the same time, he also wrote the United States Constitution in 1787. After the United States achieved independence, President Washington was elected by the United States Congress as the first president of the newly established United States of America and held this position for 2 terms. President Washington established the protocols and ceremonies for future presidents that still exist today. The most prominent expression of his leadership style to this day is his farewell address and inaugural addresses. Throughout his tenure, George Washington implemented many policies such as improving infrastructure and expanding territory. He established a national university to improve the quality of education, found a new capital of the country to ensure the capital was not dependent on any state government. President Washington also emphasized the idea of resolving local disputes. He became a symbol of the national liberation movements around the world, and to this day, President Washington is always praised by historians and considered one of the greatest presidents the United States has ever had. The life and career of President Washington. Before the American Revolution, George Washington was born into a middle-class family with land ownership in the state of Virginia. He was the eldest son of Augustine Washington, a relatively wealthy plantation owner, and his second wife, Mary Ball Washington. George Washington had several siblings, but many had passed away while he was still young. When President Washington was 11 years old, his father passed away, and at this point he inherited a farm named Ferry in Stafford County along with 10 enslaved people. And later Mount Vernon, the largest plantation of President Washington's family at that time, when his half-brother, the respected Lawrence Washington, passed away. It can be said that Lawrence Washington had the most influence on George Washington during his childhood and also laid the foundation for his future development. Throughout the period before the American Revolution, George Washington participated in many large and small battles as an officer of the local army, such as the battle with the French in 1754, which made George Washington the commander of the Virginia Regiment. However, later he withdrew from the army and returned to his plantation until the American Revolution broke out. In 1759, George Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow in the area, which elevated his wealth and status to become one of the wealthiest men in Virginia. From then on, George Washington gradually became a leader of the elite and began to participate in politics. In the American Revolution, in 1775, with the high tension between the policies of England and the leaders of the United States, the war broke out against the British government and the liberation of the colonies in North America. With his reputation and popularity, as well as his experience as a commander, George Washington was nominated and appointed as the lieutenant colonel and commander-in-chief of the Continental Army at that time. Although he was not an outstanding commander, he always emphasized on training and recruiting talented individuals, thus gradually having many outstanding commanders serving under him. During his tenure as commander-in-chief, Washington also experienced many battles with both successes and failures. New York was even completely defeated and belonged to the British Army. However, despite these difficulties, Washington and his generals continued to fight for the freedom of the nation and with the help of the French. The victory in the Battle of Yorktown resulted in England recognizing the independence of the United States. Not long after, the British also withdrew from New York. George Washington also disbanded the Continental Army and resigned as commander-in-chief. This action is considered the greatest of his when he could give up enormous power in his hands. After the American Revolution. After gaining independence, the American Congress began first steps of rebuilding the country. In 1787, the Constitution was created, along with the initial concepts of the head of state, the President. In 1789, George Washington was elected as the first President of the United States. During his 2 terms in office, he appointed important officials and implemented outstanding domestic and foreign policies. President Washington succeeded in establishing the federal government that was on the brink of collapse after the war. In 1979, after his term of office, President Washington delivered a political speech to the public about what the United States still had to do in the future to become stronger, and then returned to his business. In 1798, he was reappointed as Major General and Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Army by then-President John Adams. He served as a high-ranking officer in the U.S. Army for 1 year before passing away. Some things that not everyone knows about President Washington. Washington was a president who rarely smiled. There's something special when you learn about George Washington. He's considered as one of the most conciliatory presidents, but he was rarely seen smiling. This was partly due to his serious work, but one of the reasons that not everyone knows is that President Washington had to use dentures. During his youth, he directly bit on hard food with his teeth, which made his teeth very weak and began to shake to the point he had to use dentures to replace them. This made him very unconfident, so he smiled rarely. George Washington is the only 6-star general in the United States military. Although this is only an honorary rank that was awarded to him posthumously after 200 years, it is still the highest rank in the U.S. military. At the time when Washington was alive, the highest ranks were only Major General. However, as the military developed, higher ranks have emerged. Therefore, to ensure that no officer could surpass Washington, the U.S. Congress awarded him the title of General of the Armies, equivalent to a 6-star general with the authority to command all military forces of the United States. The only person who actually held this rank was John J. Pershing, but he preferred to maintain his 4-star rank from his active service, by changing to gold stars, so it can be said that the only person who achieved 6 stars is General Washington. There was a dispute over the opinions on the abolition of slavery. As a large slave owner, President Washington had thoughts and even some statements about his desire to abolish slavery. However, at that time, this only caused internal conflicts within the federal government, so he did nothing. From that, we can see the extent of his influence and his position as a leader in American history.